We're going to go on a magical mystery musical tour that began, I'm estimating, about 44 years ago when I was an undergraduate at Princeton. And a professor named Moreau Berger, who was head of the sociology department, sponsored the great Benny Carter, that's Benny, B-N-N-Y Carter, the king, to come and teach at Princeton. And it was a great, great thing indeed, and he deserves all praise for doing that. And Benny Carter gave a course along with Moreau Berger, father of the great Ed Berger. And I'll never forget, during one of the classes, I raised my hand and I said, how much of an influence did the rural blues have on your music? And again, he did some good stuff, that Professor Berger, but in typical Princeton, arrogant Princeton professor style, he jumped in and said, no influence whatsoever. There was absolutely no connection between country music and the kind of music that Mr. Carter plays. Well, Benny Carter bailed me out and said, well, actually, Moreau, we listen to that music all the time. And I was reminded of that exchange when I read this article by Mark Guarino, who recently wrote a book, I think Midwestern, Country Western or something. I reached out to him, but he never wrote me back. But in any event, I read this. And somebody was asking him, he was interviewing Steve Miller. So he asked Steve Miller, your parents were outliers because they hosted black musicians in their home and exposed you to music you weren't supposed to hear. What made them so different from other adults in their day? And Steve Miller said, I've often wondered that. They were raised in Missouri, near Jefferson City. They were country people, but they were musicians. On my mother's side, there were 3 musicians in the family. Everybody played piano. I had an uncle who played hot jazz violin with bandleader Paul Whiteman. They were just dirt poor farmers. I always wondered, how did these hillbillies from Missouri become so hip? How did they know all this stuff? I think it was all the radio. They were as hip as they could be about Kansas City jazz, and they had a record collection that wouldn't stop. So this is the pop musician and really a great musician in his own right, Steve Miller, talking about his parents who were, he describes as hillbillies, and yet who were super hip musically. And both these experiences with Professor Berger at Princeton and even Steve Miller talking about his parents raises this issue, which is, for some reason, we think that black people don't listen to white music, so-called white music, and white people don't listen to so-called black music, or didn't in the hillbilly era. And nothing could possibly be further from the truth. There was a tremendous amount of mutual appreciation and cross-education that went on in American music. Let me give you an example.
Somebody said, oh, this is Arnold Schultz's grandnephew or something. And Arnold Schultz is a guy that played with Bill Monroe's Uncle Pen and with Bill Monroe and taught him how to play rhythm guitar. He taught this guy Mose Rager how to play guitar. And Mose taught Ike Everly and Merle Travis. I mean, the guy's, Arnold Schultz is like the unsung father of country music that we don't know about. We know about DeFord Bailey being a black man who was an early star of the Opry and so influential, but we don't know so much about Arnold Schultz. There's no recordings of him, but you can feel the reverberations of his influence through these people, the Everly Brothers, Bill Monroe, every bluegrass thing, every Chet Atkins lick you hear. It's really kind of comes from this guy.
Pretty interesting, huh? So at the roots of country and western and bluegrass music, we have an Afro-American virtuoso. How do you like that? This kind of reminds me of the conversation we had with Vic Hobson. And if you haven't heard it, you should listen to it. It's in our podcast series on Jazz on the Tube. He pointed out, and this is well known now within the circles, that the music that we call barbershop quartet, which for decades was presented as, a bunch of guys in straw hats and striped shirts, was also an African-American creation. Think about that. There's one other little story that I want to add to this, which is the great Robert Johnson, the blues man. And everybody associates Robert Johnson with the country blues, and he certainly was a country bluesman. But like many musicians, it was a necessity for him to play lots of different kinds of music in order for him to make a living. People that are not musicians or don't know musicians don't know that not everything is always glamour and not everything is always right in their particular area of specialty. Sometimes they have to play weddings, for example. Speaking of which, believe it or not, Robert Johnson, who was a rambling man, made it as far as Newark, New Jersey on one of his trips, and he got a gig playing an Italian wedding. And at an Italian wedding, they wanted to hear Tarantella, which is an Italian dance form. Where Robert Johnson learned the Italian dance form Tarantella, I don't know. Maybe somebody hummed a few tunes for him before the gig and he figured it out. But this just goes to show you that our picture of American music is completely skewed. There was a lot more fluidity and mobility and cross-pollination and sharing and comradeship among country and city people, among white and black people. It's a much different world than has been presented to us. But let's get back to that Arnold Schultz fellow. What did Arnold Schultz do every winter? Well, here we go. Here's what he did.
He was a railroad worker that was itinerant. Apparently would go oft times to New Orleans during the winter months. When he came back in the spring, they said you could hear him through the woods. He'd be walking around with his guitar just playing as he went. And you knew he was back in town. So that's pretty cool. And Bill said he played dances with him, and they'd, come home at sunup. They'd break the dance up at sunup and ride home on their horses.
So how do you like that? The guy who taught Bill Monroe and taught the guy that taught Merle Travis would spend every winter down in New Orleans. Now, this may not be familiar to some people. New Orleans is considered a brass band place. Great pianists, of course. But what people don't know is at the turn of the last century, the 19th to 20th century and early 20th century, it was a string place, actually, before it was a brass band place. The brass band stuff didn't get going until the Spanish-American War in a big way. And New Orleans was a string city. So think about that. So somehow New Orleans, and I don't think there's 1 out of 10,000 New Orleans scholars that realizes that New Orleans seeded country and Western music. Speaking of New Orleans, we did a podcast with the great Roger Lewis, one of the founders of the Dirty Dozen Brass Bands, and hipper than hip. And here's what he had to say about his upbringing in New Orleans and the kind of music he was listening to.
What kind of music were you hearing as a kid? Obviously, the church music. Were you hearing club music at night? Maybe coming through the window.
Yeah, we didn't have television, so we had radio. You stick your ear to the radio.
Oh, okay.
I was hearing a lot of. I'm gonna tell you, as a kid, I was hearing a lot of country and western music.
Really?
Yeah. I used to, oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam and a deer and antelope play. Well, seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the sky is not cloudy all day. Home, home on the range where the deer and the antelope play. Well, seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the sky is not cloudy all day. Oh, yeah, man, I love that song.
people don't realize how much country and western music flows around. It's everywhere.
So how do you like that? We have Benny Carter, who was called the King, right? Duke Ellington was called the Duke, and Billie Holiday was called Lady Day, and Lester Young was called Prez. Well, musicians called Benny Carter the King because he was such a great band leader and arranger. And he listened to country music. And at the very roots of country music, going all the way back to Bill Monroe, you have an Afro-American itinerant worker who spent a big chunk of every year down in New Orleans learning New Orleans music. And then we hear from Roger Lewis, hipper than hip, that when he was growing up in New Orleans, he was listening to country music. How do you like that? And Steve Miller is confused about why his so-called hillbilly parents were so hip about music. Well, here's a conversation between Willie Nelson and his sister Bobby that might shed some light on that.
What I really like about hearing those kids sing and what it reminds me of is the old Booster Band days. Do you remember that? And Abbott at I guess we started at the Methodist Church, but then it really, when all the churches would get together and we'd have revivals there in the Tabernacle, which was right next to our house, that was when the Booster Bands were really big and loud, and I thought they were great. Huh?
All of the children, all the denominations.
Oh, yes. From Methodist, Baptist, Church of Christ, and a few Catholics came in.
They did. Learning the songs in the Booster Band, we have never forgotten these songs.
Oh, I know it. I'm singing them to Luke and Micah now, and they go around humming them and singing them all the time now, so that's good music to my ears, so to speak.
If we could teach the songs we learned in the Booster Band to all of the children in the world.
Everywhere. Get them started singing early.
Early. Singing about love and how you're supposed to love, how Jesus loves all the little children. The first music I ever played was Jesus, Lover of My Soul, because when I had decided that this is the day I'm going to get to learn to play, that was the only book that we had, was gospel songbooks and the books from the church.
And I learned those songs from you, and you learned to read music, so you would read them and play them on the piano, and I would sit by you on the piano stool with the guitar, and you would sing and learn the chords to those songs.
That was the way we learned to play music.
But our grandparents would study. You remember when they would sit up all night long studying their music lessons with a kerosene lamp, and yes. And we could hear them in there when do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, all night long, you know.
They did. I'm surprised their eyes lasted.
Yeah. They were really good musicians, and they really knew music theory. And of course, gospel music was the first music that they taught us.
Yes, it was.
So it's the first music that we ever played.
Did you catch that? Willie and Bobby Nelson, who were raised by their grandparents and who were hillbillies. I mean, that's what they were. What were their grandparents doing? Studying music theory and becoming really good musicians, partially as a form of worship and also for fun. But notice, up every night by the oil lamp, studying theory. So that may answer something for Steve Miller. Being a, quote, hillbilly doesn't mean you're not intelligent and doesn't mean you can't study and apply yourself. Related to this, we did a long interview with the daughter of Eddie Durham, and nobody could possibly be more country than Eddie Durham. He grew up moving cattle and hunting rattlesnakes in what can only be described as the outback of Texas. His mom was a Native American. He was raised as a Native American child. He had his hair in braids throughout his entire childhood. He didn't learn to speak English until he was a teenager. He grew up speaking Spanish. And his brother learned music theory from a correspondence course, right? And then Eddie went on to basically be one of the inventors of the electric guitar. He taught Charlie Christian. He wrote the arrangements that made Lester Young employable. He was the music director for Jimmy Lunceford and for Count Basie, and wrote the arrangement for In the Mood that's so famous by Glenn Miller, right? This was a country guy, okay? Hard to imagine anybody more central to the history of jazz and more sophisticated, but his roots, pure country. Now we're going to get into another part of the Willie and Bobby Nelson story. Everybody knows Willie plays guitar. Few people know that his sister Bobby played piano.
Do you remember us going over across town to the black church and listening to those folks sing?
Oh, I loved that. We didn't get to go often enough over
No,
there.
well, that was a long way for us to slip off and go, but we would do that, and that's some of the best gospel music in the world back in those days. Those folks really got with it, and I was wishing back then that we could take some of that spirit over to the Methodist Church.
And we tried.
And we tried to stir them up a little bit. Wouldn't it have been great, though, back in those days to have had the bells of joy there at the Tabernacles?
Wouldn't it have been wonderful?
And since we're talking about it, why don't we hear Willie Nelson?
Let us have a little talk with Jesus.
Now let us have a little talk with Jesus. Let us tell him all about our trouble. He will hear our faintest cry, and he will answer by and by. And when you feel a little prayer will turn, then you'll know a little fire is burning, and you'll find a little talk with Jesus makes it right. Well, I once was lost in sin, but Jesus took me in. Then a little light from heaven filled my soul, and he filled my heart with love, and then he wrote my name above. And just a little talk with Jesus made me whole. Now let us have a little talk with Jesus. Now let us tell him all about our trouble. That he will hear our faintest cry, and he will answer by and by. And when you feel a little prayer will turn, and then you'll know a little fire is burning, and you'll find a little talk with Jesus makes it right.
Day and night, I go to him in prayer. I can leave my every care, and just a little talk with Jesus makes it right.
Now let us
have a little talk with Jesus.
Let us
tell him all about our trouble.
He will
hear our faintest cry,
and he will answer by and by. And when you feel a little prayer will turn, and then you know a little fire is burning, and you will find a little talk with Jesus makes it right. I have a little talk with Jesus. Tell him all about our trouble. He will hear our faintest cry, and he will answer by and by. And when you feel a little prayer will turn, now then you'll know a little fire is burning, and you'll find a little talk with Jesus makes it right. And you'll find a little talk with Jesus. Makes it right.
couple of things in that clip. The obvious camaraderie between the musicians. And then also something that you just don't hear about this in modern media, which is the deep spiritual roots of the countryside of America. You hear about the bad stuff, and there was certainly bad stuff in certain places, but you don't hear about people adhering to the golden rule and living it, like Willie and Bobby Nelson. But they weren't the only ones, right? This was the ideal. This was the aspiration. That's a part of our country. That's part of our country's history, and it's a beautiful part. And it's often not paid attention to. And sometimes in the circles of people that like jazz, it's refuted. But you can't refute it because it's history.
And I was so eager to learn new music. And you were eager to learn everything.
I wanted to know everything you knew.
Everything. Well,
And I still would like to know everything you know
Well,
about music.
Well, you teach me all the time.
Probably the lessons that were taught, or the one lesson really that was taught to you and I more than anything else growing up where we grew up, was the golden rule. That was about the only one that we really knew that we could, ask ourselves, are we following or breaking the golden rule? Really, really. And that's really the only thing that we had to remember, and it's really the only thing we still have to remember.
We were taught good manners, to share, and the golden rule.
Sister Bobby, you remember a while ago when we were talking about how in Abbott, when you and I would go across town over there and to the Black Baptist Church over there on Sundays and listen to the guys sing. I mean, the folks really got out over there, and we would all go over there and listen to them and try to go back to the Methodist Church over there and try to instill some of that energy over there.
Tried to do it like they did.
Yeah. We was thinking how great it would have been if y'all could have come over there, and so that's why it's so good that we're able to do it now and sing together.
It
now.
is. It is so good. Feel the spirit with you guys.
And then the other part of this is so beautiful is, there was no conservatory education for Bobby and Willie Nelson. There were no college classes. There was what they learned from their family, what they learned playing in church, and then what they learned figuring it out themselves. Bobby did not get a chance to play professionally for a long time because of the nature of the contract that Willie Nelson had with his original recording company, which did change when he changed labels. But I wish I could remember the name of the company, but Bobby worked for a company that I think sold organs. And it was through that, she was a demo. She would demonstrate the organs in the showroom. And it was through that experience that she got exposed to the Great American Songbook, which she fell in love with. So there may not have been a lot of jazz in their early background, but she found it in the course of growing up and embraced it and got quite good at it. And before she reconnected professionally with her brother and toured with him for many years, she also played gigs at night playing from the Great American Songbook. So here's an example of Willie and Bobby Nelson playing a jazz standard together. So what do we have here? We've got the great Benny Carter listening to country blues. We've got country and western and bluegrass guitar playing having its origin in the virtuosity of an African American who, in addition to living in Kentucky, used to make frequent trips to New Orleans. We have one of the hippest of hip guys imaginable, Roger Lewis of the Dirty Dozen Brass Band, reminiscing about how he loved cowboy music as a little boy. Then we have Willie and Bobby Nelson talking about their grandparents who raised them and their diligence, their grandparents' diligence in staying up late at night to learn the intricacies of music theory. And then Willie and Bobby talking about how much they admired the African American music in their neighborhood. And then we learned that Bobby and Willie were in love with the American Songbook. I mean, they may have played something different when they were touring, but they loved the American Songbook, even though they were not raised in a sophisticated city. And running through all of this, the music of the church. The music of the church. We're going to play now a clip, a collection of things I put together a long time ago, showing the importance of the power of the church, shared by Black and White, an institution that had high ideals that a lot of people adhered to. The Golden Rule, for example. And so, long story short, it's just a slander and a fraud and a falsehood to say that jazz got its start in the whorehouse. You know, it's just such a ridiculous slander. Jazz and the American Songbook and all the people that love it and come to love it, and rhythm and blues and gospel and all this music, which is all really mixed together. Musicians do not discriminate. Good musicians do not discriminate. It all had its roots in largely country people, largely self-educated, largely inspired by the ideals of the church. And yeah, you did have some urban guys, who grew up in the city, like Benny Carter. But lo and behold, they were listening to country music too. So we're going to go out on this compilation that we made a long time ago, showing the absolute foundation of American music in the music of the church.
Somebody record too, if it sounds good and got that beat, that's all necessary. You don't wonder what it is. It's got to be music. It all comes from the sanctified churches. How you gonna get away from it? That's where the beat started. Them sisters get to shouting there, boy, and the churches is drumming. Don't you ever go for the baby? Never go for the baby.
New Orleans is a real spiritual place. And the people are really, really good. Well, the people were very kind and very creative and very spiritual. I used to go to church in New Orleans, and the spiritual church, and the people would get up and testify, and tears coming out. It was real. That's all I can say. It was. I can't say I had a happy time, because it was more than happiness. It was like your soul being, what is the right word? Being allowed to be shown.
When you see me, this is where I come from, and this is why I can do jazz, because it all started with this. I never was in the choir. I sang, and my sisters and everybody was in the choir, so I watched, and I was a part of it. So I want everybody to know, whatever you see me doing rock, when you hear Joe Camel, when you hear Give Me a Dime, whatever you hear, it all comes from that third bench over there listening to that choir. Been born and raised around the corner. I heard the music everywhere, and everybody that played jazz in New Orleans played in church. The Lasty families, the Childish family, all these people come from church backgrounds. And that same thing, you have some of the best musicians always in church. Just because the lady play organ don't mean she don't play blues either. She might not play blues in the club, but in church, you feel like she's playing it.